Whenever I meet up with Wade Davis, the adventurous academic explorer, he has just returned from some trek to the far parts of the globe. Sometimes it's a 4,000-mile overland journey, and sometimes it's a shorter jungle trek where the world's hunter-gatherers have entwined him. Wade is the explorer in residence at National Geographic. He's an ethnobotanist, anthropologist, filmmaker, writer, poet, and one of my most fascinating friends. His new work is Into the Silence, The Great War, Mallory, and the Conquest of Everest. It is my pleasure to welcome Wade Davis back to Studio 4 to tell us more.
Hi, Fanny.
Nice to see you again.
Wonderful to see you.
Well, wherever you are, you're just about to walk off the map, much like these explorers you're writing about.
Well, you know, in a funny way, the real expedition in the case of this book was into the file cabinets of the archives. It's like doing archaeology in a file cabinet. You know, I spent 12 years trying to find out who these men were who went to Everest. You know, there's been a lot of writing about George Mallory, who's kind of hogged the stage of history in a way. I mean, in 1921, when the British literally, as you said, had to walk off the map just to find Everest, there were actually, over the course of those three expeditions, 21, 22, and 24, there were 26 men, each more remarkable than the others. And what always interested me was not whether Mallory got to the top or not. And those who don't know the story, famously on June 8th, 1924, 37-year-old George Mallory, the most illustrious climber in the world, along with young Sandy Irvine, were seen as two small black dots on the northeast ridge of Everest, going strong for the summit as the mist rolled in and enveloped their memory in myth. And the question has always been, did they get to the top or not? I wanted to understand more what were the values and what was the spirit that drew them on. And I knew that all of these men, because of their age, with the exception of young Sandy, in all likelihood had gone through the fire of the war. And it wasn't that I was suggesting that they were cavalier about death, but death had no mystery to them. They had seen so much of it that all death could teach them would be their own. And life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And so over 12 years, I was able to find out where each of the 26 men were every single day of the war.
That's so fascinating. And the other fascinating part is the desire of veterans, especially the Great War veterans, to go anywhere but home.
Yeah.
They come home, their lives have changed forever. They have been in the horrible trenches of war and
well, there was a chasm. There was
tragedy.
There was a chasm between those who had fought and those who had stayed at home and still spouted the idle rhetoric of empire, often having profited from the agonies of those who were at the front. You know, it's difficult for us, and on the eve of a Remembrance Day, it's worth doing, to recall what our own grandfathers went through at the Western Front. Just consider this, the British zone of operations was never longer than 125 miles. Behind that front, they built 6,000 miles of trenches, 6,000 miles of railroad. The Ypres salient, an area you could walk around almost in a day, 4 miles by 12 miles, would see the death of 1.7 million boys. You know, the cremation began after the war. It was almost unknown before the war, but so many men had lived for 4 years and 4 months close to the rotting flesh of cadavers that it became the preferred form of dealing with the dead. Plastic surgery was born from the war, and the need to repair the shell-scarred faces of boys who for the rest of their lives would wear plastic masks and go to special camps where they could remove the masks so that they could feel the feel of wind on their gargoyle features. It simply was an extraordinary war. The regular British Army needed 2,500 shovels. In the mud of Flanders, they needed 10 million.
Where were you when this idea came to you to connect the Great War and Mallory and Irvine?
I was standing at the base of the Kanchung face of Everest, the east face, in Pitanringbo, a camp where Mallory stayed, and I was on ground taller than anything in North America, but I was looking up at 2 vertical miles of ice that rose to the South Col from the eastern approaches to Everest. And I was with a young friend of mine, Daniel Taylor, who was the son and grandson of medical missionaries. And his father had been a good friend of Howard Somerville, who climbed with Mallory in 22 and 24. And Daniel just began to speak to me about these Englishmen in tweeds who read Shakespeare to each other in the snow at 23,000 feet, and I became completely enamored.
That's one of the other interesting parts. They're in tweeds. They're scholars. Well, Irvine was an Oxford scholar. They sip ginger wine, drink brandy, and talk about ideas.
Howard Bury, who led the 1921 reconnaissance, and he was the one who in 1920 went to Tibet and secured the permission of Charles Bell and the 13th Dalai Lama, permission to build to climb Everest was an arms deal between the British and the Dalai Lama that would empower the Tibetan army in defense of the country against the Chinese. Incredible. Howard Bury, who orchestrated that, had once, you know, he slipped into Asia in disguise. He would anoint his body with scented oils. He was famous for killing a man-eating tiger that had run off and eaten 21 holy men in India. He, in the end, spoke 27 Asiatic and European languages. In 1913, on the eve of the war, he is in the mountains of heaven, Central Asia. He buys in a marketplace a little baby bear, rides all over Asia with it, and of course he takes it home to his estate in Belvedere in Ireland, and as bears do, it grew up, and Agu became a 9-foot bear, and his favorite form of exercise was to wrestle Agu in the arbor of his estate. In the war, he has one moment where he nearly breaks. He is ordered to build a communication trench to Devil's Wood, where that day 4,000 boys had died. In the darkness, shell fire, he's digging, he realizes he's digging not through the shock soils of Picardy, but through pure rotten flesh of cadavers of past engagements.
The ascent itself, apparently, according to you and many others, Irvin wasn't much of a climber. He didn't know much about climbing.
No, but you see, strength counts for more than technical prowess on Everest. The danger and the hazard of Everest is the sheer wrath of the wind, the power of the mountain, the vicissitudes of weather and climate. You know, and so, you know, Irvin was actually perfectly a good candidate. He was ferociously strong. He had proven himself in Spitsbergen. He was a mechanical savant, so he could deal with the oxygen apparatus. So he wasn't the sort of misplaced choice that some people have said of him. The really great story of Everest, though, is the story of a local hero, a Canadian hero, Oliver Wheeler, and this was something that came as a surprise to me. In 1921, Oliver Wheeler, a veteran of the war, a great Canadian soldier, was seconded to the expedition by the Survey of India. Now, in time, Oliver Wheeler would become the Survey General of India. He would be knighted in World War II, but at this point, he had the task of mapping the inner massif of the mountain with a new photographic survey technique that had been pioneered by his father in the Canadian Rockies. Amazingly, it was Oliver Wheeler, not George Mallory, who found the doorway to the mountain, the key to the mountain, the route that even to this day men take and women when they climb Everest from the north, up the Rongbuk Monastery, up the East Rongbuk Monastery to the foot of the North Col. That was found not by Mallory, but by Oliver Wheeler.
By E.O. Wheeler, Oliver Wheeler. Did Mallory ever give him credit?
Very, very reluctantly. In fact, Mallory, for reasons that I never really understood, had an abiding dislike for Canadians. I didn't hold that against him much. But
other Brits have.
Yeah, but he never would acknowledge that Wheeler was a climber. And even when Mallory himself reaches the height of the Lac Balan, for the first time does look down across the head of the East Rongbuk Glacier to the North Col, what Mallory's always called the Col of Our Desires, because they knew they had to find a route up that col. Even then, that night, he writes a letter to his wife Ruth saying, if only we knew where this glacier went. Well, he did. Oliver Wheeler's map of 2 weeks before told him. But the wonderful story is when I got on to Oliver Wheeler, I found out that his son lived in West Vancouver, John Wheeler, who had had this fantastic career in the Geological Survey of Canada. I went to see Mr. Wheeler, and all historians will tell you that in 1921, when the British had to march off the map 400 miles just to find Everest, that there was only one diary kept, a kind of curt thing by Mallory's friend Guy Bullock that was published in 1960s. Right. I went to see Mr. Wheeler, and at the end of a long, beautiful day of conversation, he pulls from his shelf 2 treasures, 2 fat volumes of journals that his father, Oliver, kept in 1921 as he marched across Everest with Mallory.
It was kismet.
Yeah, it was incredible.
Perhaps a good day for you. Yes. Mallory found the mountain visceral, really. His wife Ruth didn't want him to go.
Well, he didn't want to go. I mean, actually, Mallory, the irony is that Mallory in 1921 was reluctant to go. He'd been away from his family a lot during the war. He really took the assignment as essentially a good career move. By 1922, he had become in the embrace of the mountain And he famously said, as he signed on to return in 1922, that we must always remember that this mountain has a ferocity that it would humble the strongest men to embrace. And then, of course, at the beginning of 1924, he definitely doesn't want to go. He's got a premonition of death. In fact, he goes, one of his last things he does is he goes to see the widow of Scott of Antarctic fame, who famously had perished with his men on the ice of Antarctica. But in the end, the mountain has too much of a draw. And in the end, you know, I think Mallory had no choice but to do what he did. And
Why?
Because I think for all of these men, you know, there's an amazing passage after they know Mallory's dead. You know, death had taken on a completely different thing. Go back to Oliver Wheeler for a second. In those journals, there's an amazing moment in the approach march of 1921 when Arthur Kellis, a high-altitude physiologist, 56 years old, too old for Everest, dies on the approach march. As they bury him, Oliver Wheeler's notes in his journal simply say, "Buried the old boy in the morning, thought it'd be in the afternoon, terribly sorry to have missed it, but I do hate funerals." How do you miss the interment of one of your fellow climbers as you're walking across Tibet together? Well, I knew the answer had to lie in the Western Front. Oliver Wheeler was a war hero. He was with the 7th Mer Division of the India Corps. You forget that within 2 months of the outbreak of war, the British Regular Army was annihilated. The entire British sector of the front was held by the Canadians in the north, the Indians in the south. By this point, the topography of Armageddon was in place, the trenches existed, both sides were sapping each other. It came to the attention of his command that the Germans had put 2 saps within 30 feet of their front line. He's ordered to go over the top to bury the saps and do so in a way that will dissuade the Germans ever doing it again. All hell breaks loose, artillery, machine gun fire, black night, they go over the top. To their horror, they discover the saps are full of Germans about to attack them. The result is ferocious hand-to-hand combat of the most hyena sort. The Indians push the Germans back, but not before the sap is lined 3 bodies deep of dying boys of both sides, flapping about, Wheeler said, like trout in my kraal. He did everything he could to get his wounded out, but with the orders to bury the sap, he would never know if he had not buried some young boys alive. So when he gets to Tibet several years later and says, "I do hate funerals," you see the way the war played into the lives of these men.
And yet they were men of big heart. When the Sherpas died, so many Sherpas died. In one instance, I think 7 Sherpas.
In 1922, the avalanche of 22, and Somerville famously said, "If only Englishmen had shared their fate." I mean, take Howard Somerville. He was a surgeon at the Somme. He was told to expect 1,000 casualties within a week. He was with one other surgeon going out for their 6-hour shift at the casualty clearing station when he looked around and he was surrounded by 6 acres of dying boys, piled up, as one recalled, like cordwood. He would never come back from Everest. He became a medical missionary in the south of India, devoting his life to saving the living that it might sweep away memories of the dead.
So it certainly makes sense why these men could stand with 150 leeches hanging off of them.
Oh, I mean, these guys were so tough. Sandy Williston, on 10 minutes' notice, went off an expedition to Africa. Took 3 months to find the expedition, 9 months in the jungle. Then he's got to go home. Why go back the same way? He walks from the source of the Congo to the mouth.
It's incredible, really. Like as you said about Mallory, dysentery made him stronger.
Well, you know,
it wasn't an irritation. Just said, well, it's a thing.
You know, there's a beautiful thing as they finally know that Mallory is gone. As they retreat from the valley, one of them looks out of his tent in the spectral light of the full moon, and he says, "Looking at that scene of our great drama, it was not hard to understand that the price of life is death. And so long the payment be made promptly, it really doesn't matter when you die. Somewhere up there, 2 still forms, yesterday living their heart's desire." And this is a key line. "Today they are gone, without ever knowing the experience of decay." And this was a haunting specter of the Western Front, even at that moment.
Into the Silence, The Great War, Mallory and the Conquest of Everest, Wade Davis, National Geographic explorer, scholar. We'll come back.